Alright guys, SP Sugawara will be coming into the game tomorrow, but you guys probably already know there is actually going to be another SP character who is also a block specialty setter, and that's going to be SP Koganegawa, who will only be coming to global in 4 months time. So before you guys actually decide, do you definitely want to go for Sugawara, I want to just do a quick comparison video between the two characters so that you guys know exactly what's the difference and can confirm your decision on whether or not you actually want to summon or skip for SP Sugawara. Now, this video is not going to go into full depth of everything they're able to offer in their kit. If you actually want to see exactly what SP Sugawara's kit can do, like in full depth, and also my source on that, I already posted a video 2 days ago, okay? So I'll link that in the comment section as well, but you guys can refer to that if you actually want a more in-depth review. Today's video is just more going to be a quick comparison, and that's kind of what, rather than reading through their kit, what I've done is I just summarized them across 4 different categories so that it's easy to compare between the two characters. Okay, so first up we have their setting ability, and for this one there's already going to be a bit of a difference because for SP Sugawara it's actually an ultimate type, so therefore it's 340% multiplier and also a cooldown of 8 net crossing, whereas for Koganegawa it's actually a looping skill, so the multiplier is going to be a lot lower, almost half of that multiplier, and the cooldown is also shorter. Now it's only at 6 net crossing. Now in terms of the other additional effects able to bring, for Sugawara you are able to bring 20% attack technique buff and also 16% up to 16% awareness and also reflex buff to the spiker if they actually manage to score. Whereas for Koganegawa, he is able to provide, first of all, just to himself 30% awareness and also 10% buff to the setting stat, and also for the teammate who will be spiking, he can also provide 10% awareness and also 15% spike buff. Now, if you just compare the two setting ability, both in terms of the numbers and also in terms of the effect, I would say it's quite obvious that Sugawara is going to be better. However, I just want to also point out that the numbers here might be slightly misleading in terms of the fact that even though the numbers for Koganegawa is a lot smaller, for example, this is only 180% multiplier, if you actually add down the fact that he can self-buff with 30% awareness from here, and also, by the way, later on, I'll talk about how he can pretty much get a permanent 50% awareness buff as well. So those two together can almost always make sure that he does actually crit, and then add on the setting buff from here as well. If all of those do actually trigger, you're probably more looking at a multiplier which is close to around 300%, I'll probably say, assuming Sugawara doesn't crit. Then the number all of a sudden is actually a lot more comparable. And then in terms of the buff stats, yes, the numbers here are lower, 10% awareness, 15% spike buff, whereas this one is a 20% attack buff. However, this first of all is guaranteed rather than relying on certain kind of trigger condition. Second thing is that this does cut across 2 different multiplier zones. So in theory, this can potentially also have a similar effect to what this 20% attack technique buff is able to provide. So some of the numbers are slightly misleading here. But probably overall, if you want my review on the two, I'll probably say Sugawara is still better in terms of setting, but not by massive miles. Okay, so I'll probably just say Sugawara does win here, only by a tiny bit in terms of setting ability. Now, when it comes to serving ability, it's kind of going to be the other way around, and I would say Koganegawa is going to be slightly better here. Now, the reason for this is that Sugawara is just able to provide 10 morale and also 16% buff to all of the stats. Now, this is to all of the stats, which is definitely very nice. However, it's only for one rally. Now, what Koganegawa is able to provide, first of all, he can only provide this as skill resonance tube, so there's going to be a bit of a hurdle here. But if you have met that hurdle, what he can actually provide is 10% defense technique buff, but that's for the whole match. And then the other thing is that not just for him, but also for your whole team, whenever someone serves, they're going to get 20% awareness. And also, if the enemy receive is not of a perfect receive, then you're also going to hit them with a 16% spike debuff. Now, this is actually really easy to trigger, because if you actually manually controlling your serve to be of a perfect quality serve, the enemy cannot get a perfect quality receive of your serve. Okay, I mean the only exception would be if the enemy have the likes of like HAIKYU, who can turn a normal receive into a perfect receive. But other than that, when you have a perfect serve, it's just impossible for the enemy to get a perfect receive of that. It always can only be of at most a normal quality. So this is actually going to be almost like constantly triggered whenever you are serving, which is also very nice. So that's kind of why if you actually compare the two, I'll probably say Koganegawa is going to have the slight edge here, because first of all, he is able to provide this for the whole match or pretty much permanently, while Sugawara was have a slightly bigger number and also across all of the stats, that's just going to be for one rally, okay? So I'll probably say Koganegawa has a slight edge in terms of surfing ability. Now let's take a look at their defensive capability. So for Sugawara himself, he doesn't actually have any blocking skill, even though he's a block specialty setter. However, what he can do instead is he can buff every single block and also receive on your team by roughly 20% of their stats. Okay, the actual formula is more like scaling based on other characters' blocks or receive stat, but on average, I'll probably say it's roughly about 20% increase in terms of their block and also receiving capability. So that's what Sugawara is able to offer. For Koganegawa, he does actually have a skill which is a blocking skill, and in fact that's actually his ultimate, so his strongest skill. And he can block ult. He has a ultimate block with 40% reflex, and like I said early on, and also which I will mention in a bit, he pretty much have a permanent 50% awareness and reflex constantly. So whenever he does do a block ult, it's pretty much guaranteed to be a crit block as well, okay? Because you'll be getting minimum 90% reflex. Now, furthermore, you don't even have to use that ultimate as a block skill itself. It can also be used as a buffing skill because you can actually be using this to buff up your other character's block ultimate. Now, obviously, this would then go into cooldown afterwards, but essentially, rather than you having to actually block manually yourself, you can actually allow your teammates to still benefit from that ultimate as well, okay? So that's also a very nice selling point. Now, the one thing you may be thinking here is that, oh, this is an ultimate skill, therefore it must have a very long cooldown, which is 12 net crossing. That is the case. However, if you do actually have him as skeleton full and also Koganegawa is actually up front, then that reduces massively to just 4 cooldown. And that's actually very, very important because normally the timing between 2 blocks is 2 cooldown already, okay? 2 net crossing cooldown already. So that basically means that if he is only at 4 net crossing cooldown for his ultimate attack, that basically means he can use it every other turn, or he can buff up your teammate by a whooping 100% multiplier every other turn as well, okay? So that's kind of what this is also very, very crazy strong. Now, if you compare the two, I will probably say if it's a very block heavy team, then it's going to be very clear that Koganegawa is going to be the clear winner. Or if you actually need a blocker, a dedicated blocker, in which case Koganegawa can actually block himself, then Koganegawa is going to be the clear winner here. Whereas if you're actually playing a team where you don't actually rely on blocking as much, then Sugawara does also have his own niche because he can, after all, buff up both your block and also receive, and also this is for every single turn as well, okay, or every single touch. So even though the number is nowhere near as high as it's 100%, if you actually think about this is for every single block and also every single receive, it's just basically like a small buff, but you'll be applying that constantly versus for Koganegawa, it's more like a massive spike in buff. Okay, you're able to provide a huge amount of buff, but nowhere near as regularly as what Sugawara is able to provide. So overall, on this front, I'll probably say the two are pretty much similar. But if you do actually play a very block-heavy team where you actually require the setter to block himself, then Koganegawa is going to have the edge. But in other scenarios, I'll probably say the two are more or less equals as well. Okay. Now, then we move on to the team buffing perspective. Now, for this one, Sugawara is able to provide 16% buff to all of his stats. Now, this is at a trade of a stamina consumption, but he will be essentially regenerating that himself anyway. So it's just like a net neutral there. So you just end up with a 16% buff to all of your stats. And also you can get a 12% attack technique and also 24% defense technique as skill rating 4 as well. Now, for those kind of technique buff, the number wouldn't actually be that high in practice because it kind of depends on whether or not you won the previous rally in order to see which kind of technique buff you will be getting. So it's very rare that you see both of them happening at the same time. And also the 12% and 24% I have here actually require 3 different stacks. So it's actually going to be quite rare for you to hit the full potential, but I'll kind of just list out the maximum here anyway, just so you know exactly where's the cap. Now for Koganegawa, what he can do instead is that he can also do lots of team-wide buff. However, it's not something you're able to do straight away. For example, on turn 1, it does actually require certain conditions to be met before you're actually able to stack them up. And I'll probably say on average, probably take at least 2 or 3 turns to fully stack all of them. Now, this is going to be gradual though, however. So for example, the first bullet point I have here, which is that 20% crit buff, that can pretty much get triggered after just the first turn. But the later on ones, you might need 2 or 3 turns to actually fully stack them, okay? So after just the first turn, what you can able to get is pretty much a 20% crit. So that's both awareness and also reflect buff to your whole team. On top of that, Koganegawa himself is also able to get an extra 30%. And that's kind of why I say, you pretty much get a permanent 50% awareness and also reflect buff here. And that's kind of why whenever you use Koganegawa to do a serve, to do a set, or to do a block, very likely he will be critting all of them, okay? On top of that, he can also buff up all your front row's block stats by a proportion of his own block stat. It probably will roughly work out to be about 10%. Okay, I just done the math for you guys, but that's normally around 10%. And then furthermore, if the awareness for anyone on your team is more than 100%, you're going to get them with a 15% strength buff, and if the reflex more than 100%, you're going to get a 25% spirit buff instead. Okay, now obviously he can only provide 20% awareness and also reflex buff himself, so it does still kind of require a bit of team building and also the character's own kit in terms of whether or not you're able to trigger them. But to be honest, a lot of the future meta characters are kind of going towards a direction of like critting every single hit anyway, so this should be somewhat easy to satisfy. And then furthermore, as skill resonance full, he's also able to provide another 10% crit damage, so once again that's both strength and also spirit. And furthermore, if the player on your team actually have block skills, that can get an extra 35%. Okay, so this once again is going to be a massive buff in terms of the crit damage, but it does have a bit of a dependency that it has to be of a blocking skill, or the character needs to have a blocking skill. Okay, so if we actually talk about team buff, what you can see is, once again, it's going to be quite clear that for Sugawara, it's going to be a lot more universal, right? It's buffing all of the stats, it's buffing both attack and also defense technique. Whereas for Koganegawa, it's a lot more specialized. First of all of them are more crit damage focused, or crit rate focused, so everything to do with crit. And the other extra additional buff he is able to really provide kind of have the dependency on either teammates needing awareness for reflex reaching certain threshold, or you are just playing a very block dominated teams. Okay, so I'll probably say overall across the team buff, I would say Koganegawa has much higher cap if you're actually able to meet all of those conditions, whereas once again Sugawara is a bit more of like a flat universal, not massive amount of buff, but pretty constant, pretty easy trigger, and can be used in all kind of universal situations. Okay, so overall, now that we have went through all of the categories, what you can see is the two characters, their roles are actually going to be quite obvious, okay? So Sugawara is going to be slightly better at setting, but slightly worse at serving, which is going to be the other way around for Koganegawa. And then a lot of the buff and also defensive actions he's able to provide is just a tiny bit of buff, but you're able to pretty much trigger that constantly, and it's going to be almost like permanently built in. Whereas for Koganegawa, you have a much higher ceiling in order to hit all of those maximum buff that you're able to provide. However, that often requires either specific teammates or specific speciality that you're trying to build across, or sometimes even require higher skill resonance just so that you can get the most out of it. Okay, so I'll probably say Koganegawa has much higher ceiling than what Sugawara is able to offer, but you do need a much more specialized team in order to fully utilize that as well. Overall, both of them are terrific. It's going to be more down to in terms of team building, in terms of what you actually want to do. Obviously, if you just want to have someone with a block label but can be used in like a universal kind of circumstance, for example, you want to play with two setters so that you have one setter for the main speciality that you're really building toward, and then a second setter for other purposes, maybe for liberal sub, etc., then Sugawara is going to be a very good choice in those kind of circumstances because he is so universal, he can fit into all kind of teams. However, on the other end, if you actually want to do a very specialized blocking team, then obviously you can actually trigger a lot of the extra buff that Koganegawa is actually able to provide. And then as a result, obviously what Koganegawa is able to offer is going to outshine a lot more than what Sugawara is able to offer in a very block heavy specialist team. Now, having said that, that is talking about if you actually have to make a decision between just one setup between Sugawara and also Koganegawa, which one do you want for a block team, then in which case Koganegawa is going to be the clear winner. However, in reality, I'll actually probably recommend you guys to play both of them together in a block specialty team. And that's because if you actually take a look at the team buff they are able to provide, what Sugawara is able to offer is basically buff to the main stats and also to the technique stats. Whereas what Koganegawa was able to offer is all of the buff to the crit rate and also the crit damage. And once again, if you are familiar with the crit damage formula, of the damage formula in this game, with how all of the multipliers work, you then realize the two characters actually perfectly complement each other because they literally offer some kind of buff in the other one that the other character is not able to provide. Okay, so if you actually have both of them together on the same blocking team, you're actually able to cover the entire spectrum of all of the different damage multiplier. So for a very dedicated block specialty team, I will actually probably recommend you play both of the characters together. But if you really have to make a choice on just playing only one single setter, then yes, Koganegawa is going to be slightly better in those specialized blocking teams, whereas Sugawara is going to be a bit more of a universal team, not quite as good in those block specialities, however does have that winning edge in terms of the fact that he's able to have a more of a flexible and also universal role. Okay, so that's going to be my source on the two character and also a quick rundown in terms of their comparison. Let me know what you guys think and also whether or not you'll be summoning for Sugawara tomorrow.